So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have this icebreaker going on Facebook comments saying, what is one trend from your high school years that hasn't aged well? So far, I've seen things like mullets, just say no, they said on there, and also big bangs. That was another one. And that got a chuckle out of me because a few weeks ago, I saw this picture online, and it's basically a yearbook photo of seniors from the mid-'80s, which happens to be my sister's demographic. That's when she graduated. And it says, hey, if you had this hairstyle, you're now eligible for the upcoming vaccine. I sent it to my sister, and she didn't think it was funny at all. I mean, it was not funny to her, but I got a good chuckle out of that. For me, in high school, when I was like a freshman, some of the seniors and those that were graduating started getting tattoos, which culturally in North Mississippi, not a lot of people did anyway. So that was big rebellion at the time. But one of the big things people were getting was between their shoulder and their bicep, and it was this ring of barbed wire. And I remember looking at the first guy that had that, and I thought, that is awesome. Like, that's the toughest thing I've ever seen. What's cooler than barbed wire on your arm? Now, if you have a barbed wire tattoo, or you have had it removed, I'm not throwing shade at you for having a barbed wire tattoo. We just know that a few decades later, not as many people are getting that on their arm as they used to. You see, that's the thing, is in just a couple of decades, some things go out of style and never come back. Some things are coming back like mom jeans, which was not a style in the 80s and 90s. It was purely survival, I think, but now it's a thing. People think they look great. I'm probably showing my age at that point, but they were called mom jeans, so that's what moms wore. But out of that, when we think about this series we're starting, we're in the book of 1 Samuel. We're kicking off a series today. This is the setting of 1 Samuel. It was written 1,000 years, and it's set in the time 1,000 years before Jesus. So we're looking at a 3,000-year-old book. And talking about, do things age well? We're talking, some things go out of style in just decades. How does 1 Samuel stand up to the test of time? People ask, why do you read a book that's thousands of years old? How can that be relevant to my life today? And the exciting thing is, when I look through the book, like 1 Samuel, you begin to see real people. And they're dealing with some of the same problems we have. They have real problems, just like we do. They have some of the same hopes and dreams and fears, some of the same unrealized expectations in their life. And they encounter a real God. And as a result, some lives are changed. And we get to see how we're a part of the story of God through 1 Samuel. Because that's one of the big things when you look through the Bible, although it was written over thousands of years, 66 different books, 40 different authors. But there's one theme running through all of that, and that is God redeeming his people. He has created us, and now he's redeeming us now that we have turned our backs on him through Adam and Eve, and we're all cut off. And so what I want to do when I teach as a pastor and a teacher is I want to connect the dots. Growing up, I didn't always get the dots connected to some of the stories. I'd heard of David and Goliath, and I'd heard about Adam and Eve, but how does Adam and Eve in Genesis tie into 1 Samuel? How does 1 Samuel tie into Jesus? How does Jesus tie into my life today? And so that's one of the exciting parts of this, is just getting to connect some of the dots. And maybe for you, some of these stories that you grew up hearing, we're going to talk about Hannah dealing with infertility. We're going to talk about David and Goliath. This is a huge shift in the story of God's people in the book of 1 Samuel. It's a shift from the time of the judges, the rescuers of the people, and we looked at them before, to the time of the kings. The first king is Saul. The second is David. And we're going to see a lot of their story in the book of 1 Samuel. In the Old Testament, and when Jesus was reading the Old Testament, it was just simply Samuel. It wasn't 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. It was just one big book. They've broken it apart. They did the same thing with 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, so 6 books instead of 3. But we're not going to go through all of 1 Samuel in one sitting. We're not going to do that for the next series, because it would probably be about 2024 when we get done. And so instead, we're going to look at a section of it and be able to come back to that. But my goal is to help us connect the dots from Genesis to 1 Samuel, and then from 1 Samuel to our life today, and ultimately to understanding Jesus as our King. And so to do that, in a moment, I'm going to read just a couple of verses from 1 Samuel. But before that, let's just start with Genesis. Let's get caught up to 1 Samuel, because if you look in your table of contents in a Bible, there's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel. So when you listen to those names, do they go in order? What does that make sense to you? What do you know about those books? So I'm just going to start in Genesis and get us caught up very quickly. In Genesis, we have the story of God's creation, and he creates Adam and Eve. And then over time, they disobey God, they sin, so they are cut off from God, and there's this longing, there's been that disconnect ever since. We feel that disconnect. From the moment we're born, there's this feeling of there's something just not right, and that's where religion comes in. People are trying to fill that void in their life, and they'll worship many things. Sometimes they worship their career, sometimes they worship other gods. They're trying to please God. They're trying to get to that place. But in the book of Genesis, God calls out a man named Abram. Actually, he changes his name to Abraham, and he tells you, I'm going to bless you. Not because your tribe is the largest or anything like that. I am choosing to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing to all nations. And now we know God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. In the book of Genesis, Jacob's name is changed to Israel by God. That's where we get the Israelites and the tribes of Israel. I didn't know that till college. I was like, I don't know how these all tie in together. How does Jacob get to the Israelites, to the Hebrew children, like all these different titles? I didn't know that growing up. And so just realizing, okay, so that's how we get to the people of Israel. It was because they're the descendants of Israel from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's how we end the book of Genesis. The people, actually one of Israel's sons, Joseph, brings them into Egypt to save them from a famine. And how God used all that, we've looked at Joseph's life before. But then you pick up in the book of Exodus, the next book. 400 years later, they're still living in Egypt, but now they're in slavery. And as a result, God raises up Moses. Moses takes the people out of slavery in Egypt and not into the promised land, but he takes them into the wilderness, and they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That's where you get the books Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's when the law comes in. And so it's all written down during that time. And then at the end of the law, as Moses dies, we pick up with the book of Joshua. Joshua's the successor to Moses. He takes the people from the wilderness into the promised land. Now, Joshua's book is a story of warfare, conflict, and conquest. They literally move into an area and drive out all the people, and they were commanded to by God. Now, that doesn't age well in our culture today, right? To go in and just literally kill or drive out everybody in a land. But when you look at the story and you see what God tells them, he tells them specifically why he does this. One, to fulfill his promise to give them a land. But second, he says, this is to fulfill divine punishment on these people. It's the groups like the Amorites and the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Philistines, mostly the ites, but then there's the Philistines. And so they go in and they don't fully conquer the people. They don't fully drive them out. But he says, you're going to be my divine justice because the sin of the Amorites has come to me, and eventually I'm going to punish them for that. So God uses the people of Israel as his tool of punishment and justice on the other peoples. And that sounds harsh to you, realize that he then uses those same people as a tool of justice on his own people when they turn their back on him, because he's going to do whatever it takes to bring them back. So they settle into the land. They drive out most of the people, but there are still pockets of them. And so that's the end of Joshua. At the end of Joshua, there's actually, Joshua gives a command to the people. He's like, look, we didn't take the land because of how strong we are or how smart we are. God gave us the land. Don't forget God in this story. Please don't. And they said, we will never do that. One generation later, you get it in the book of Judges. And it says that they forgot about the God of Israel. They started following the gods of the Amorites. They began to sacrifice their children on altars in hopes of better crops, because that's what it meant to worship another God. It was not just like they went to a different building down the street. They were sacrificing and giving their lives to another God. And so because of that, God began to oppress them with different groups of people, like the Philistines would come in. Or the Midianites. Gideon fought the Midianites. Gideon's one of the judges in this story. But God would raise up an oppressor. They would oppress the people. And when they would finally get to the place where they could not save themselves, they would cry out for help. And God would hear them, and he would raise up a judge. A judge was a rescuer. Their job, a man or a woman that would come in and help overcome the enemy. And then there would be peace in the land, and they would be turned back to God for a while. 1 or 2 generations, they would be back to worshiping the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, the God of Abraham. And then the cycle would start again, and they would forget. So for 400 years, they go through this cycle. Judge after judge after judge, falling away, being restored. And so you pick up at the end of the book of Judges, because we're getting really close to Samuel now and what's going to happen with the kings. And look at what it says in Judges 21:25. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So there was no leadership. Now there was supposed to be. Israel at this point was known as a theocracy. That means God was their king. But that's going to become a problem in the book of Samuel. And especially when they have bad leaders, they're going to want a king. And so we're going to pick up with that in just a minute. But before we get there, we have the story of Ruth. Now, Ruth comes somewhere during the time of Judges and leading up to Samuel. And the reason we know that is because there's a genealogy in it. But if you don't know the story of Ruth, Ruth was a Moabite woman, one of those peoples that they were supposed to drive out. But this Israelite man married a Moabite woman named Ruth. When he died, she ends up going back home as a widow with her mother-in-law, who's an Israelite, back to Israel. And while there, one of the family members, known as a kinsman redeemer, in other words, when he marries her, he redeems her and brings her back into the family. His name was Boaz. So she gets married to Boaz. And at the end of Ruth, there's a genealogy. Now, genealogies can be the most boring thing ever. And sometimes they can give you chill bumps. And it just depends, because sometimes you see in the genealogy some dots connecting. And I've had more of those chill bump moments in the last couple of weeks getting ready for this series. I just can't tell you. There's so many times I can't wait to get to, but we're going to start with the introduction today. But there's so many points where you begin to see God at work in the story. And so look at what happens at the end of Ruth, talking about Boaz, her husband. It says that Salmon fathered Boaz, and then Boaz fathered Obed. Remember, when you hit weird names, say them fast and with confidence and hope nobody notices. That's what I'm doing all day today, because there's another one of these lists, believe me. But then it says Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. The key characters in the book of Samuel are Samuel, who is a judge who becomes a prophet and a priest. And then there's Saul, the first king of Israel, and then the second king, King David. That's the David, the son of Jesse here. It's amazing when you realize that Ruth is David's great-grandmother. Only just a couple of generations before, Ruth was a Moabite woman who has been redeemed. And you begin to see God's story in this. When you look through genealogies, it's amazing, because you're going to see that Ruth is part of the genealogy of David. Later on, you're going to see that Ruth is actually part of the genealogy of Jesus, because his genealogy runs through David. And it's not the first woman that doesn't seem to fit the profile that stands out in a genealogy. When Joshua was taking the promised land, they went to Jericho, and there was Rahab the prostitute. She's actually in the genealogy as well. Excuse me. And so out of that, when you start looking, I'm 20 feet away, and there's nobody in the middle. So I'm not coughing on anybody if you're at home wondering. But for some reason, I got a catch. Maybe I'm just choked up when I think about Ruth is David's great-grandmother, because that did give me chill bumps when you start realizing how short a time period we're talking about. So out of that, you pick up with the end of Ruth being connected to the story of David in just a minute. And this is a cool genealogy. It gives you chill bumps at the end of Ruth. Now we pick up in 1 Samuel, and we're going to look at verses 1 and 2. And so here's what we get in this one. We get a genealogy and polygamy. That's all you get in the first two verses. You know, how do you make a sermon out of that? Let's find out. Let's see if we can do this, okay? But I will tell you, a lot of genealogies, you go through the Bible, one thing to remember when you're reading through them is God is a God of the details, and these people matter to God, and that's why they were recorded in this. And you see things that don't fit and that or kind of stand out, and you begin to get excited out of that. You see that bigger picture. None of that's really the exciting part in this genealogy at first. It's like, who are these people and why are they listed at the beginning of 1 Samuel? You're going to start this book off with a genealogy, and it turns out it's not that exciting. But what we're going to see is there's a cool story that goes with that of how God is using these people. And it actually encourages me when you see that. So verse 1 says this. It says, there was a certain man of Ramathaim, Zophim, of the hill country of Ephraim. And his name was Elkanah. And he was the son of Jeroam, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph. Again, I have no idea if I said any of those right. But notice this about Elkanah. In the end of verse 1, it says, his name is Elkanah, and he was an Ephrathite. Well, I did have it up there. An Ephrathite. Now, he had two wives. Okay, starting to liven up the story a little bit. Okay, there's two wives, so something's going on. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. Now, Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So that's the story we're going to look at today. This is the beginning. So we've connected the dots from Genesis to here. It's the time of the judges. There's no one, there's no one ruler. There's no one king. They're not following God as their king. And so there's a lot of things going on. But we pick up in the story of these two people, Elkanah, Hannah, and also his second wife, Peninnah. You see, Elkanah probably married Hannah. And then when she couldn't have children, she was barren. He married Peninnah, and she had children for him. One of the most important things you could do as an Israelite was to have children, carry on your name, to give your land to, all these things. This was your legacy. And if you didn't have children, there was no legacy. Now, I will say this as we get started in this. When you hit polygamy in the Bible, all over the Old Testament, you find polygamy. It is tolerated, but is never celebrated. And every time you see polygamy like this, married to more than one woman, what you find is conflict. You find pain. You find they were not actually where they needed to be to follow God's plan. And so it's not the only time we see this kind of picture. There's barrenness in other places. You think about Abraham and Sarah. Again, tried to take matters in their own hands instead of following God's time. Those are the kind of problems that come about when we don't trust God's plan. But that's what we pick up with. A woman who is dealing with infertility and a husband and his other wife and their kids. So how do you make a story out of that? Well, it turns out, next week we're going to look at this story. And it's the story of Hannah praying. And she ends up having a child, and they name him Samuel. He's the one that's going to anoint the first king and the next king in Saul and David. And a lot of people will just take Hannah's story and say, well, Hannah prayed and she had a child. So if you're dealing with infertility, pray and you'll have a child. That's not what the whole story's about. If you're dealing with infertility, that is not something that we take lightly as a church. We know that is a reality in our world today. And she was dealing with that. It doesn't necessarily guarantee those are going to happen, but it is okay to pray and ask for God in those areas. But when you look at the story of Hannah, what you really see is she is really a picture of Israel at this point from a spiritual sense. She's physically barren, but Israel is spiritually barren, not producing any fruit. There's no life or vitality in Israel at this point. They're doing whatever they wanted to do. The judges are coming and going, and the people are turning their backs. So who is actually leading the country? And so as a result, what we're going to see in this story is how God's going to use some people in unlikely ways, use some people that you don't expect. And that's really the real story of the Bible. When you start going back and you study this story again, you find out Elkanah was an Ephrathite. Turns out Ephrathites were settled around Bethlehem. So these two no-name people in a genealogy have a child around Bethlehem. They weren't important. There's nothing about their genealogy that makes them important or anything like that. They're just simply normal, everyday people that God begins to use in extraordinary ways. And it starts in Bethlehem. Does that sound familiar to anybody else? Like two normal, everyday people having a child that changes the world. I mean, there's some excitement when you begin to realize God is at work in ways that we may not understand or expect, because that's not how we expect God to work. We didn't expect our coming king, to be born in a stable. The people rejected him because they didn't expect the Messiah to be more interested in spiritual salvation than physically being saved from Rome. And so maybe we're overlooking some of the ways God's at work because we're looking in the wrong place. And so my prayer is that during this time we'll see some more of that. But God raises up this man, Samuel. He's going to be hearing from God, and it's a time, it actually says in 1 Samuel 3:1, Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. That's the priest at this time, and he's given to them, and we'll look more at that. But it says, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. There was not a lot of clarity at this point. But Samuel is this hinge person in the Bible. He's pivotal. He's the last of the judges. It says in Samuel that he judged Israel for many decades. He was the last of the judges, and then he becomes the first of the prophets. He's also called a seer or a prophet during the time in Samuel. And he's also a priest. So you get your prophets, priests, and kings coming. This is a shift from the time of judges, the time of the tribes, to a nation that's under a king. They're going to have to set up an army. They're going to get taxed. And that was what Samuel told them when they looked around and they saw every other country has a king and we don't. Yeah, I know God's our king, but we want a real king. We want an earthly king. And Samuel says, you don't really want this. For one thing, Samuel took it as rejection of himself. He was the leader at this point, and he didn't do a great job in areas of his life, especially raising his kids. And we'll see all that. But God said, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Give them exactly what they want. And they got a guy named Saul. Saul was head, and he was a head taller than everybody else, and he was very handsome. The reason we know that is because it mentions that multiple times. Did you know he was handsome? It's that, you're talking to somebody and they're enthralled with somebody else. It's like, he was handsome. Did I mention he was handsome? All in all, he had everything going for him to be the king they wanted. They wanted that mascot. They wanted that guy to lead them into battle, and he had all the outward attributes. But we begin to see there was a heart issue with him. And before it's over with, Samuel's going to go to him. When he gets impatient and takes on a sacrifice for himself, we'll look at that. There's all this stuff goes on in Saul's life, and God takes his spirit from Saul. That was his blessing. That was his power. And eventually he anoints David, and David's going to become the king, but David's going to mess up too with Bathsheba later on. And then he's going to kill her husband. After committing adultery and then doing that, when the prophet Nathan goes up to him and says, you're the man, he is broken, he repents, but he writes a psalm. And in the psalm, he's repenting of that sin. He says, cast me not away from your presence, O Lord, and take not your spirit from me. He said that because he saw what happened to Saul. He knew what it meant for the spirit to leave a man because he had been under Saul as his king. So you begin to see all this stuff in David's life. You get to see the rise of David. It ends with Saul dying, and then the 2 Samuel starts with David becoming the king, but there's a lot of the story of David in this book. But even by the end of 2 Samuel, great, they have the king, the man after God's own heart, but he still messes up. By the end of 2 Samuel, you're left wanting a better king. You're left wanting more. And then you go through the rest of the books of the Old Testament, and you realize the people still turn their backs on God. The kings were never good enough. And we're longing for the true king. There's a king that Hannah talks about in her song. The second chapter of 1 Samuel is basically a table of contents written in a song form because Hannah sings a song, and there's some prophetic vision in that, talking about a king that will come out of the line of Judah, and he'll be like a lion, and his reign will be perfect. They thought it was going to be David because he filled all those boxes except the perfect part. But we know who the perfect king is on this side of Easter. We see Jesus from the line of Judah. He's the Lion of Judah, and he didn't come the way we expected him to. He didn't do things the way the world expected him to. He actually flipped the world upside down. As a leader, he was a servant. When he goes they wanted a king to go and fight their battles and lead them into battle. He did more than just fight battles with them. He fought the battle for us because the battle was against sin, and when he died on the cross, he fought and died for us. And when he rose again, that Easter Sunday 2,000 years ago, he conquered death and sin and guilt and shame. That's our king. That's who we worship. And we're going to see how he shows up so many times in the book of Samuel. We'll see glimpses of what could have been, and we'll see a better picture through Jesus. And so I'm excited to get to do this with you. I'm excited to see where we go with this. There's going to be a lot of dots getting connected, I hope, for you as well. I know it has already been for me as I've started digging into this. But we're going to enjoy this over the next couple of weeks. And before I pray and we continue in worship, maybe you're here and you're hearing this whole idea of Jesus as a king. Maybe you've gone through the motions of going to church. You think you're kicking the tires on Christianity. You're trying to figure out, do I have to be good enough for God to love me? What are these things? Jesus is our king because he loved us when we were unlovable. Romans tells us Christ died for us while we were still sinners. It's not about how good you are. It's about how good he is. And his grace and his mercy is what he's shown us. That's why we worship him today. If you've not experienced that, I invite you to come see me in the back. And just say, I want to become a Christian, or I want to follow Christ. I'll know what you mean, and we'll start there on this journey. If you're online, just put Jesus in the comments, and we'll reach out in the near future, or send a private message to the Grace Park page. It comes to me. I'll be glad to reach out and talk to you more about what it means to follow Jesus. But Jesus is our king. We say that all the time here, but we really mean it because he's the only one worthy to be our king. Nothing this world has to offer. There's no messiahs out there that's going to change the world. The only one that can is Jesus, and as his followers, we're going to trust him to lead us to be a part of that revolution. See, church isn't an organization. Church is a revolution. Church is an active living organism that he calls his bride. Jesus calls the church his bride. And so we want to be a part of that, not just the organizational part. We want to see where we fit in this story. The book of Samuel is a narrative. You got Psalms, that's poetry. You got the letters of the Apostle Paul, that's the epistles or writings. We read writings different than we read poetry. You read a letter different than you read narrative. These are stories is what we're going to see, stories of real people, and we get to see where we fit in the story and how God can use us in unlikely ways, unusual ways. We're going to get to be encouraged through that as well. So I hope you'll continue to join us with this series. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. And I thank you that all of it is God-breathed and useful, that it is living and active. And so we come before you now, and I pray that this series in Samuel, I pray that our time in it would change us to be more like you. I pray that you would show us your grace and your glory, even through the midst of people who are far from perfect. But Lord, you are able to work in spite of them, and you can do the same in us. And so we're asking for that in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.